Why, hello there, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. My name is Mr. Dogwhip333, and welcome back to TNO Development Diary 31, Part 3 for Debrouillez-Vous. That was better than last time when I pronounced it. Apologize for not uploading yesterday. I had work to, work took it out of me. And I'm also preparing for a vacation in this upcoming weekend, so my mind is in a lot of different places, and it just tired me out, so I couldn't get to this. But we're here now, and just in time to investigate Southern Africa, not to be confused with South Africa, which we're also going to be looking at today, but primarily, even. Now, this is probably going to be the most notorious, for lack of a better term, change to all the Africa lore. You might notice, one, it's a little bit smaller. Two, those are some very Afrikaner-looking names. And if you know your apartheid history, you might know that these are very nationalist, apartheidist names popping up. So South Africa is no longer no longer led by the United Party. They're led by the Nationalists. And yes, apartheid is now officially in South Africa. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Also, there's nowhere that the Germans can invade. So obviously, the South African War is no longer in TNO. I'll take a moment of silence for that old bit of lore. Alright. Meanwhile, let's see what we got to replace it. The modern state of South Africa is the result of a devil's bargain at the dawn of the 20th century. As decades of competition between the British Empire and the independent Boer republics in southern Africa came to a climax in the Second Anglo-Boer War, Cape Colony Governor Alfred Milner promised that black and mixed race South Africans would prosper in a more racially tolerant society should Britain be victorious. Yet when drafting the Treaty of Vereeniging, I'm going to be butchering some African names now as well, / possibly native African. Here we go. When drafting the Treaty of Vereeniging at the war's conclusion, the British were all too quick to play the role of Pilate, washing their hands of the messy issue of enfranchisement. They promised the defeated Afrikaner Boers that no decision would be made regarding enfranchisement for non-whites before self-government was granted of newly incorporated colonies. On this point, the British kept their word, and by the time the union was declared between the Cape, Natal, the Orange Free State, and Transvaal in 1910, only the Cape had any sort of non-racial enfranchisement. A major turning point in South African politics came in 1914 when J.B.M. Hertzog's founding of the National Party. Hertzog was one of the pillars of Afrikaner politics during the first decade of the Union. The former Boer general and cabinet minister held stubbornly to his resentment of the British and his republicanism. Under his leadership, the MP quickly became the primary opposition to the SAP, displacing the Unionists who folded into the SAP in 1920. The interwar period was one of the greatest social upheavals in South Africa, as urbanization and industrialization exacerbated intense racial and class frictions. Hertzog's National Party capitalized on the underlying anger of the poor white workers, forging coalition with the Labour Party that won a shock victory in the 1924 elections. The National Labour government fulfilled its promises by instituting welfare policies and labor protection for the poor whites. Non-white workers were confronted with a reinforced color bar. Hertzog also pushed for an expansion of the franchise to all whites, first by granting white female suffrage, and then by removing property and wealth restrictions, which substantially weakened the already minimal power of non-white voters. The Great Depression was a massive blow to the South African economy, and desperate times called for desperate measures. Smuts and Hertzog agreed to merge the parties into the United South African National Party, or UP. The hardliners of the National Party, this fusion government was a step too far. In 1935, Daniel Francois Milan head of a Cape branch of the ENP, formed the Purified National Party, or the GNP, with fellow hardliners. UP's victory in the 1938 general elections seemed to say that South Africans had no interest in the extreme Afrikaner nationalism of the GNP compared to the unity and stability promised by the UP. Smuts and Herzog were building their political future out of sand, and this became apparent all too soon. Only a year later, in 1939, the German Reich invaded Poland and triggered the Second World War. As a British dominion, South Africa was naturally expected to support its mother country, but there could not have been a more contentious issue for the government. Many Afrikaners, including PM Herzog, were not interested in putting South African lives on the line for a country they wanted independence from. When Parliament voted narrowly to enter the war, Herzog resigned rather than fight, leading Smuts to be appointed as his wartime replacement. For the Afrikaners who agreed with Herzog, there was more to this conflict than just the geopolitics involved. Many had come to openly sympathize and admire fascism, and Nazism in particular. During the 20s and 30s, many Afrikaner hardliners saw fascism as a vehicle and need to bring about an independent Afrikaner republic immersed in the principles of Christian nationalism. South African fascists, almost all with ties to the old MP, formed groups like the Grey Shirts, the Boronisi, and the New Order. Most prominent South African fascist organizations would prove to be the Ox Wagon Sentinels, or the OB, founded in 1938 as an Afrikaner cultural association. By 1940, its commandant, Johannes van Redensburg, had organized a 1,000-strong paramilitary force, the Stormjagers. Many members of the GNP, who were soon rejoined by Herzog to create the Reunited National Party, or the HNP, were open in their desire to see Nazi Germany defeat Britain, thinking that would dramatically speed up their timetable of independence and republic. Others saw Nazism as a natural reaction to the threats of capitalism and Bolshevism, both of which, according to the HNP leaders like Eric Lew, were to be blamed on the Jews. Lew and his party colleagues had spent the 1930s stoking anti-Semitic hate against Jewish refugees who came pouring out of Germany. The HNP enjoyed strong relations with most of the fascist organizations, although the OB soon began to cause them headaches. Initially seeing the OB as a powerful ally, given its tens of thousands of highly energized members, Milan formed a pact with the OB leadership in 1940, the Cradock Agreement. The agreement recognized that the HNP and OB operated in different spheres, the former politics and the latter in culture, and that neither group would meddle in the affairs of the other. Unfortunately for Milan, von Rensburg was as ambitious as he was extreme, was soon using the stormtroopers to engage in open sabotage efforts. On this, Milan was willing to defend the OB from the government, but when Rensburg began to jockey for the role of leader of the Afrikaners in the political space as well, Milan turned harshly on his former ally. By the time he assumed the title of Volksleader at the 1941 Party Congress, Milan had openly thrown the OB under the proverbial bus while trying to moderate the HNP's image. Milan recognized that the HNP could not win the general election in 1943, but he had put everything he could muster into the campaign. The result, a blowout victory for the incumbent UP, ought to have crushed his ambitions. What Milan recognized, however, was that this triumph for the UP and Smuts was highly illusory. The government gained seats on its majority, yes, but the HNP had gained more. With Herzog out of the UP, a majority of the Afrikaner vote was now Milan's. Above all, it was now clear that the war was not going in favor of the Allied powers. Only months before the July elections, German troops had come ashore on the beaches of southern England as Operation Sea Lion commenced. The rally to the flag had no doubt helped the ever-defined Smuts, but war fatigue and the humiliation of the British would be decisive in the long run. Before the dust from the election had ever settled, Milan and his top lieutenants were taking action. Unlike the UP and the age, increasingly aloof Smuts, the HNP could not rest on its laurels. The troublemakers within Afrikanerdom would need to be finished off. Milan had been right back in 1940. The OB were still a valuable asset. They would just need definitive taming. Milan, working through former OB members in the HNP, quietly reopened a dialogue with the OB Grand Council. The argument he presented to them was clear enough. Anyone with eyes could see that the Axis was on the upswing. German landings in Britain and its offensive across the Volga, the Italian advance into Egypt, the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. It was only a matter of time. South Africa could only meet the moment, however, with Milan in charge. The Afrikaners needed a strong leader to meet the moment, and Van Rensburg, for all his bravado, was not capable of stepping into power. Moreover, the more trouble Stormjagers caused, the more difficult a task Milan and his party would have in securing the support of the moderate whites. Whether by luck or providence, the Grand Council agreed with Milan's reasoning. Van Rensburg was ordered to cease operations, and a reconciliation between the OB and the party produced the Second Cradock Agreement. The end of the war in 1945 humiliated the Smuts government. Having gone against so many of his fellow Afrikaners to defend the same empire of the camps, Smuts had gambled everything on Allied victory, and he had lost. What were South Africa's rewards for joining this pointless crusade? Thousands of dead across East Africa, Egypt, and in the British Isles. There were also the new dependencies. In the last year of the war, as it became obvious that Britain could not hold out much longer, Smuts had ordered the UDF into the High Commission in territories of Beluchiland, Swaziland, and Basutoland, in order to stop them from falling into Axis hands. The peace treaties had made no mention of them, and the new collaborative government in London had much more to worry about than 3 of its least valuable territories. Peace, then, was certainly a bitter pill to swallow. The Smuts government limped along for 3 miserable years, fully conscious of its failure from Milan, and the HNP marshaled overwhelming Afrikaner opposition against it. As the 48 elections approached, Milan and his cronies fell back on a series of simple but devastatingly effective attacks. There were, of course, the charges of national humiliation and popular betrayal from the entry into the war, and the claim that only a strong leader could navigate the new order South Africa found itself in. Oh, that's the name of the mod. But what struck an even deeper chord was Milan's apocalyptic vision of race relations. The demands of the war had spurred industrial growth. This growth meant an increase in the need for labor, in which South Africa could only be met with African laborers from the reserves. The growth of the non-white urban proletariat, conscious of their leverage within the economy, deeply alarmed white society. Some of the UP leaders around Prime Minister Smuts were prepared to offer social and economic reform to meet the moment, but they were swimming against the tide. According to the HNP Volksleer, the only solution to this imminent crisis was a redoubling of segregation under the policy of apartheid, a complete separation between white and black, with the latter serving as a permanent underclass for the benefit of the former. The results of this election proved this strategy was far more successful than even the HNP could have counted on. The party was handed a clear governing majority. The party wasted no time capturing South African institutions one after another. The police, the courts, the military, the power status. They were all packed with loyal HNP members and turned to tools for furthering the party's agenda. Under Milan's strict leadership, Parliament passed scores of apartheid legislation. Southwest Africa, League of Nations mandate assigned to Pretoria since Versailles, was officially made the Union's 5th province. Its new seats in the Assembly and Senate were guaranteed wins for the HNP. Laws further restricting land occupation and travel by race were soon enforced, tightening the state's grip on the non-white population. The Communist Party was banned, and the state was granted extraordinary powers to act against any group construed as a threat to the racial order. For all his zeal in pursuing apartheid ever, Milan was always one step behind its most strident proponents within his party. More problematic than their enthusiasm, however, was their increasing willingness to countenance extra-constitutional means to speed up the process of transforming the state. Above all, Milan always prided himself as a constitutionalist, but in the eyes of men like Hendrik Verwoerd and Johannes Strijdom, the PM's reluctance to bend the rules was becoming a liability. Increasingly exhausted, his party slipped further and further out of his grasp. DF Milan suddenly resigned the premiership in 1952. Into his position slid the energetic and tenacious Johannes Gerhardus Strijdom, the HNP's strongman of the Transvaal. While Milan had balked at defying the constitution, Strijdom, the Lion of the North, barreled forward. Within months of his ascension, the government began to reshuffle the judiciary. Up until then, the courts had been one of the few obstacles in the way of apartheid's implementation, and the new PM was determined to break that resistance permanently. It was in the midst of a complicated battle against the courts that the issue of the High Commission territory, so long sidelined, reemerged with nearly disastrous consequences. The Smuts government had occupied the High Commission territories in the waning days of the Second World War, and the Beaverbrook government had declined to press the issue. Now, however, the Duke of Bedford was determined to correct the mistake. Bedford demanded the return of these territories, threatening all manners of consequences, but Strijdom refused to concede anything. The territories had been claimed as the British Empire were disintegrated, and the South Africans would no more return them than Canada could be expected to return Bermuda. Bedford, infuriated, deployed troops to Rhodesia while calling on the Germans for support if it came to fighting. Germania watched with interest as Strijdom in turn deployed the UDF to the Rhodesian border. In a move that the world I think they need to add something there. The Reich refused to commit itself against South Africa, even pressuring their British clients to give up on their old territories in exchange for a few token corporate concessions. Since the end of the High Commission territories crisis, analysts have hotly debated the Reich's actions. Some argue the Master of Europe had simply been stretched too thin, as it still dealt with resistance across its occupied territories while suffering from a sharp economic downturn, all the while supporting other colonial actions, as in Madagascar and in Kenya. Others suspect that Germany saw much more value in a friendly Pretoria than in a marginally expanded British Empire, and that the Reich was already at work extending its influence into the Union. Regardless of Germany's reasoning, Streatham successful standoff with Britain skyrocketed its popularity. The PM judged that the time was perfect for a decisive break with Britain, the dream of the Afrikaner nationalists since Vereniging, a republic. The referendum the next year was passed with a decisive majority. At one time, the Anglo-South Africans would have presented a major challenge of a scheme, but now, after watching their mother country transform into a fascist puppet and having nearly come to blows only months earlier, loyalists to His Majesty King Edward VIII were few and far between. With that, it was done. The Republic of South Africa was now finally independent. While Streatham had worked to consolidate the HNP's institutional power, his mentor and Minister for Native Affairs, Hendrik Verwoerd, had been working towards the ultimate expression of the apartheid doctrine, the homeland system. Developing upon the native reserves first established in 1913, Verwoerd envisioned a future in which all Africans would live in such territories amongst their people, ruled according to their historical customs, able to develop at their own pace. Of course, for Verwoerd, this development would never outstrip that of the white Herrenvolk. Verwoerd saw the two chiefdoms of Swaziland and Basutoland as excellent test cases in how the homelands might develop. Native authorities working harmoniously under Pretoria's sovereign authority, but free, for the most part, to conduct domestic affairs under their traditional laws. By the end of the 50s, Verwoerd had identified several of territories to be granted this strange form of self-government within a few years. Prime Minister Streatham died unexpectedly in 1958, leading to a fierce competition between possible successors, but in the end, Verwoerd came out on top. His commanding personality, political mentorship of the late PM, and the status of the HNP's leading racial theorist all point in a single direction. Only Dr. Verwoerd could lead the HNP into a future that promised to be ever more turbulent. While many legalist parties oppose the HNP, the system of minority rule itself is opposed by two main groupings, the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. Of the two, the ANC is by far the older formation, having been founded in 1912. In its early years, the ANC was primarily a party of black elite and middle class, with very limited outreach to the masses. Inspired chiefly by Gandhian philosophy, the ANC maintained a stance of strict nonviolence. Attempts at mass mobilization occurred under the leadership of Josiah Gumede in the 1920s, but he was eventually ousted from this position and replaced by the conservative Pixley Ka Iska Kseme. The ANC began to gradually revitalize in the 1940s under the leadership of A.B. Zuma, who was able to successfully take advantage of an upsurge in discontented black trade unionism. The radical ANC Youth League was founded under his leadership, and they would quickly become the dominant faction of the ANC, surpassing the central leadership and building up the first generation of anti-apartheid freedom fighters, among them Nelson Mandela. The creation of apartheid had huge impacts upon the ANC, with the Youth League being at the forefront, demanding a more radical policy against the government, which they successfully achieved with a program of action. The program of action demanded mass civil disobedience, strikes, and deliberate defiance of the apartheid laws, which led in turn to the Defiance Campaign. The campaign's demands were not enacted, but it proved that radical action could work. The ANC, however, were beginning to fracture over the issue of whether or not the anti-apartheid struggle should adopt a multiracial stance. Figures like Mandela wanted to begin official cooperation with the underground South African Communist Party, alongside other Indian, white, and colored organizations that opposed apartheid and minority rule. They were able to successfully push for this goal, organizing the Congress of the People in 1955, and forming an official alliance between anti-apartheid organizations, adopting the Freedom Charters, stating their core principles, and making it clear that the struggle against apartheid included all races. Much of the ANC's Youth League, however, felt betrayed by this policy, believing that it represented a step backwards for the program of action, and that this Freedom Charter focused insufficiently on the black majority. In addition to this, there was a strong dislike for the Communist Party amongst much of the Youth League, the ANC and South African Communist Party being historical rivals, and the ANC being a traditionally anti-communist organization. In 1959, a major split of the party occurred of this, with Robert Sobukwe and Potlako Labalo leading a significant section of the ANC cadres over to a new party, the PAC. The PAC's program stressed the idea of South Africa as a solely black African nation, and took heavy inspiration from Pan-Asian rhetoric in the co-prosperity sphere, seeking common ground in the statement of Asia for the Asians, Africa for the Africans. In addition to this, the PAC firmly rejected communism in all forms, disavowing any cooperation with communist organizations, declaring they had no interest in class struggle, only national liberation. Okay, that's interesting. So we have two different factions of resistance to apartheid, as it seems, or the apartheid regime. You have the ANC and the PAC. Seems the PSC are going to be explicitly co-prosperity sphere aligned. The ANC, from my understanding, could be supported by the U.S., but the Republic can also potentially be supported by the U.S. It's going to be interesting dynamics going on there. I wonder if it's going to be president-specific. Because I can think of a couple presidents who would probably jump on the opportunity to support the government. George Wallace immediately comes to mind. Maybe Goldwater. Maybe Nixon. I'm not sure on Nixon. Kennedy Humphrey, I don't believe they would at all even consider it. Interesting stuff going on. No single event better encapsulates the pervasive racial violence of South Africa than the Blesberg massacre. Further into Prime Minister Verwoerd's ambitious goals for Homeland Policy in 1960, the HMP issued removal orders for Basotho, Swazi, and Swanee in South Africa, and showed defiance both the ANC and the PAC organized major protests all across the country. While South African police unleashed violence to suppress many of these demonstrations, the township of Blesberg in the Orange Free State was the site of the most severe confrontation. Armed officers opened fire on the protesting crowds, killing dozens and injuring scores more. In the aftermath, Prime Minister Verwoerd brought down the full force of his state. Justice Minister B.J. Vorser invoked the 1950 Suppression of Communism Act, banning the ANC and the PAC. Both organizations were scattered as the authorities hauled thousands of activists to prison. Pakalaka Labello, Secretary General of the PAC, fled to Azad Hind, leaving Robert Sobukwe to manage the now underground movement. Meanwhile, the ANC's leadership dispersed, with some hiding in Bechuanaland and others escaping to as far away as Ghana. Both groups have prepared to transition to armed struggle and have organized paramilitary wings without a ready source of weapons or a strategy to follow. Both the MK and the POCO have been able to accomplish little more than basic training for volunteers. So this is South Africa, led by Hendrik Verwoerd. Our timeline is not different from what he described. Prime Minister of South Africa. Architect of apartheid. Got stabbed to death by some random Greek guy. Very, very interesting sort of stuff. And let's move on. Ever since South African forces seized German Southwest Africa, the politicians have been determined to incorporate the territory into their country. Jan Smuts, South Africa's representative to the Versailles Conference, pushed for and ultimately received acceptance of Southwest Africa as a Class C mandate under the League of Nations. Under this classification, the territory would be governed as if it were an integral part of South Africa. South Africa's leaders, Smuts among them, fully expected that one day Southwest Africa would be recognized as the fifth province in the Union. South African policy certainly reflected this belief. Thousands of settlers were encouraged to immigrate to Southwest Africa by the post-war governments. When South Africa's parliament established a white-only legislative council, politics soon divided between the old German settlers and their new Afrikaner and English counterparts. For years, this German voting bloc, resentful of their new neighbors and opposing incorporation, managed to secure dominance in the council, but by 1930, they had lost significant ground to the United National Southwest Party. Unsurprisingly, National Socialism became quite popular in Southwest Africa during the interwar period, just as it gained many admirers in South Africa proper. To his credit, Smuts took decisive action to clamp down on many of these pro-Nazi groups, and working with the UNSWP, they banned several fascist organizations. In response, pro-Nazi German settlers formed the Deutsche Südwestbund as a cultural association under the leadership of Ernest Emil Dressel. For much of the 1930s and 40s, facing Pretoria security, the German community in Southwest Africa was on a serious back foot, but the Reich's victory in the Second World War and the HNP's in the 48 elections resulted in a dramatic reversal. The suppression of pro-Nazi groups, which the Smuts government had continued to enforce, was soon lifted as Pretoria reestablished normal diplomatic relations with the Reich. The main beneficiary of this position in Southwest Africa was, of course, the Bund. Ernest Russell would eventually retire from his position as the Führer of the organization, replaced with Adolf Brinkmann. It is an open secret that the Reich Foreign Office and Abwehr have funneled significant resources into the Bund, and Brinkmann himself has met several times with Helmut von Leipzig, a Southwest African-born Wehrmacht officer who has on several occasions been sent to Pretoria with German military delegations. With the League now defunct, the HNP was free to decide Southwest Africa as the country's declare Southwest Africa as the country's fifth province. Parliament quickly allotted new province seats in the House Assembly and the Senate, all of which would end up in the National Party's hands. At this point, the German settlers' distaste for the Afrikaner largely abated, and the Bund made it clear it stood behind the government. The National Party collapsed in Legislative Assembly in 1953, while its party leader, Jacques Niehaus, adopted an ultra-conservative tack that led nowhere. From that point on, in Southwest Africa was an HNP stronghold, and a signal of extremism baked into HNP's everyday politics. The party's chairman in Southwest Africa, and since the 1950s, has been Senator Johannes von Strauss von Moltke, a former fascist gray shirt. It was during the Freedom years that the South Africa lawmakers began to turn their attention to implementing the new racial order in the Republic's fifth province. It helped that, in the colonial period, the Germans had already established a native reserve system that the South Africans could take advantage of. Most of these reserves were located in the north of the territory, above the police zones, but demarcated where the state maintained European policing. As the timetables for the Homeland Scheme in South Africa progressed, Native Affairs Minister Verwoerd tapped his longtime ally and fellow racial theorist Michiel Daniel Christian de Wetnel to lead a commission aimed at expanding the Homeland System into Southwest Africa. When Verwoerd found himself as the next PM after Stryhome's unexpected death, he picked de Wetnel as Southwest's next administrator, with a remit to implement the recommendations of the commission. While opposition exists amongst the Southwest Africans, it is so far proven to be underdeveloped, under-equipped, and heavily divided along ethnic lines, making large-scale resistance all the more difficult and armed resistance an impossibility for the foreseeable future. The nationalist cause is currently dominated by two organizations, the first being the Southwest African National Union, or SWANU, under, Jararetundu Kosunguzi. I don't know if that was terrible, actually. The Southwest African People's Organization, or SWAPO, led by Sam Nujoma. The urging of Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah, host of Nujoma and SWAPO's headquarters, both groups have pledged to integrate into the Southwest African National Liberation Front, or SWANLF, but as of 1962, only 10 steps have been taken to bring this dream of a united front into reality. Britain kept many of its African territories following the war, but this was not true for the High Commission territories. The High Commission territories, consisting of Basutoland, Swaziland, and Bechuanaland, were Britain's South African possessions under their direct supervision as compared to the self-ruling Union of South Africa. These territories had a long history of opposition to settler encroachment during the late 19th century, and while each eventually fell under British dominion before the Second World War, London protected them from Pretoria's expansionist impulses. The British declared a protectorate over the Bechuanaland territory, which at the time was divided between various Swana chiefdoms during the Berlin Conference of 1885, before even making this known to the Botswana themselves. Initially, the territory was expected to go to Cecil Rhodes' British South Africa Company, but Rhodes' ill-fated Jameson raid caused Whitehall to shelve the plan. Still, the consolidation of British rule in South Africa, culminating in the creation of the Union in 1910, the incorporation of South Africa seemed inevitable. It was continuously delayed, however, thanks to the public and private lobbying efforts of the Ngozi, the willing Swana chiefs, and their agents. At first, South Africa's occupation of High Commission territories at the end of the war brought few real changes to life in the Protectorate. It was not even clear in what capacity the Smuts government even intended to administer Bechuanaland. The Protectorate already had been run from the South African city of Mafeking. An effective reserve system had been introduced in 1913. More dramatic changes were introduced following the ascension of the HNP. Official documents began to refer to the territory of Bechuanaland, rather than the protectorate, as they had continued to do so during Smut's tenure. This attitude would later culminate in South Africa's standoff with the British government in 1954, ultimately leading to the 1955 Republican referendum. Prime Minister Strydom took these new policies even further. Rather than seeing Bechuanaland as a British protectorate under new management, or even just a large Swana reserve in line with nascent homeland plan, he moved to expand African presence northwards into the territory. To entice settlement, the government moved to dispossess a few African freeholders in the Baralong farms, the only area in the protectorate where individual Africans were allowed to own land. This land was then sold to settlers at a substantial discount. Pretoria then transferred the administrative capital of the territory from Mafeking to Francistown. By the time of Verwoerd's premiership, thousands of settlers had taken up new residence in Bechuanaland. Charles Swart now represents the South African government in Francistown. A party rival of Verwoerd, Start lost the battle, succeeds Strydom, and has been sent to the political wilderness with a largely thankless task of carrying out Pretoria's will and its northern frontier. Counterbalancing the territorial administration is the Native Advisory Council. The council's current speaker is Bathoen Gaiseswi, Kagozi of the Ba Nwakisi. For the most part, he has found himself at peace with his new South African overlords, although he maintains an interest in uniting the Swana chiefdoms into a federation under a single paramount chief. Who would have the credibility to claim such a mantle, though, remains rather unclear. While these institutions constitute the accepted range of political involvement for Bechuanaland's elite, a new force is emerging in the territory. The Bechuanaland People's Congress has not yet faced official proscription like the NC or the PAC, but it is cast in that mold. Founded in the late 1950s by a former school teacher Ngaliman Motsete, exiled activist Motsamai Umfo, and Philip Matante, a veteran apostolic minister and Witwatersrand gangster. While the BBC has grown substantially, it is strained by competing visions for the future of the movement. Mufo and his followers in the party believe in the charterist principles of their ANC cousins in South Africa. Watane is increasingly identified with more Africanist PAC. These divisions have caused a paralysis in the movement, and it's clear that something must give, and soon. For South African masters of Bechuanaland, the crisis in the opposition can only be seen as an opportunity. Indeed, with Southwest Africa having been officially integrated, the most fervent settlement advocates in Pretoria now wonder if the former protectorate is destined to become the Republic's sixth province. So, the thing I noticed is that Sretsekama isn't involved in this at all. Maybe ties in with the Native Council? I don't know. If you don't know who Sretsekama is, there's an excellent video. There are a couple videos I watched it. I think one is from Brit Bong. Is it? I forget if that's Brit Bong. Is this the one? I think this is one. The title is a little clickbaity. But I think this is the same guy. Very interesting figure. I believe he was born to a chieftain. Had some sort of chief or royal bloodline, but he gave that up to marry a white woman. And then when Botswana, which Bechuanaland became after independence, he became the first president. And Botswana, if you look at Africa today, it's the most stable country economically, and probably politically as well. So if they're just going to be cutting him out, it's going to be a little disappointing. Brit Monkey, that's who did it. That's it. There was also a video by Hosier. Some solid videos all around. Brit Bonk is someone else, not Brit Monkey. I forget who Brett Bong is, but I don't think it's someone you want to recommend. But yeah, if you're looking for any resources, I'd recommend this Brit Monkey video. This is a more contemporary one. Barb did a video of Geography Now. And there's like some travel stuff. All seems pretty interesting. Anyway, now that tangent is over, let's check out these areas right here. After 1948, HNP rule transformed the small landlocked chiefdoms of Basutoland and Swaziland into de facto autonomous homelands under South African sovereignty. Although, officially, both polities remain in a legal gray area. Internally, South African overlordship had also the effect of reversing the very modest steps that have been taken towards diffusing and democratizing political power in the polities. For Pretoria, strong centralized and traditional authority would be its conduit to rule over its new subjects. In Basutoland, they supported the ascension of a young and ambitious Moshoeshoe II. Walking through tobacco magnate Anton Rupert, Pretoria and Moshoeshoe sidelined the Basuto National Council in favor of the newly installed Basutoland Advisory Commission. Moshoeshoe's cooperation with the South African regime dismayed many of his loyalists, thought to use the paramount chieftaincy as a counterweight to the oligarchic chiefly class that the colonial order empowered. This reversal drained support from the former loyalist groups like the Basutoland Progressive Association of Samuel Sipipi Matete, and towards oppositional movements advocating for modern independent Basutoland. At present, the two largest opposition groups, the Basutoland National League under Chief Joseph Lebao Jonathan, and the PAC-aligned Basutoland African Congress under Nasuto Mokele, have formed a united front in calling for a constitutional system of government able to check Moshoeshoe's currently unlimited powers. Is Moshoeshoe? No, Moshoeshoe's the guy who died earlier. This next guy, Sapuza, I did some research. Interesting fact of this guy, Sapuza II. He is the longest reigning monarch that we can verify the start and end of his reign in recorded history. He ruled for 82 years and 254 days. Oh, that is your fun fact for the day. He had 70 wives and 210 children. Holy shit. And I thought Future had a lot of baby mamas and children. No. That's nothing. Holy shit. Alright. Anyway. To the east, Swaziland's estimable Ngwenyama Sapuza II rules his lands as a royal dictator. Once a reformer engaged in the work of his progressively minded subjects, the aging monarch has become increasingly wary of any efforts to limit his royal prerogative. In that sense, South Africa was offered quid pro quo, that of obeisance in return for a free hand domestically, has been a godsend. Contrast to the backwards Basutoland, Swaziland has had something of an economic boom since the 1940s. Swaziland is home to many profitable mines and plantations, most of which are in the hands of European corporations and a thriving settler community of nearly 10,000. Unsurprisingly, the settlers who made their outsized voices heard for the European Advisory Council have benefited greatly from the arrival of HNP and its representative, Jacobus Loubster. Democratic and partisan politicians do not exist in the new Swaziland, and even the Andla Lakanagwane, the aristocratic council of the Ngwane nation, has been marginalized. Of course, politics have been banished. Far from it. I think they mean to say politics have not been banished. Alongside the European Advisory Council, other advocacy groups exist, like the African Welfare Association, but they pale in comparison to the AC's influence. Opposition to Sapuza and South African influence have come from the Swaziland Progressive Association. While handicapped by the monarchy's extensive popular support, it enjoys true leadership under men like Dr. Ambrose Zwane and John Nkuku. Unfortunately, this has come at something of a cost, as Nkuku, despite his skill, has proven to be rather authoritarian himself, threatening to split the organization. For his part, Zwane looks not only to the neighboring South African ANC for guidance, but increasingly their president Nkrumah's Accra, and the only insistence of South African authorities has prevented is visiting the capital of Pan-Africanist action. Of course, this reference had to be put in. There's a comment of the guy who got. All right, so this is it. Now, I think the lore is pretty interesting. I think there's a lot of interesting dynamics that could be gone down and examined. My main problem is it sounds like, from my understanding, this is all going to be skeleton content. At least for a long while. They might add content to it after, and, like a decade or whenever. And I don't want to. I don't want to be a damper or a party pooper on this, because I do find this fairly interesting. Don't get me wrong, I do like some of these new lore bits, but and it's not like the South Africa had crazy content to begin with, but going from something that was at least playable, had a bit of a narrative, you can make some decisions, to just skeleton content is going to be a little disappointing. Now, if they end up dropping a focus tree alongside it, great. If I've been misinformed about that, I'll happily eat my words when the rework for this comes out, for Africa comes out, and there's a focus tree there. But as it is right now, I just kind of look at it, I'm like, okay, I guess saying goodbye to some more content, and we're not replacing it with something really substantial. Now, that said, I do find a lot of interesting stuff with this lore, and if they do end up adding on to the content, I do think that's going to be quite interesting. But that will come when it comes. And speaking of coming, the next part will be out probably tomorrow. We'll go ahead and end things here. That's it for South Africa. Well, Southern Africa, rather. We got some interesting stuff going on here. And once the update comes out, or if there are any more leaks, officially sanctioned leaks, I'm not going to be looking at any 4chan shit. At least for the YouTube channel. But that'll be it for Southern Africa for now. Next video is going to be going over how the superpowers can interact with this, and realistically, it's going to be most of the gameplay that we get to see there. So, I'm going to leave things there. But thanks always for watching, gang. Like if you liked, dislike if you didn't. Leave any comments, feedback down in the comment section below. I read all comments I get, and I do appreciate any all feedback you might have for me. Hit the sub button and the notification bell if you want to keep updated with these uploads as they come out. Check out my various links down in the description box below. And I will see you all in the next video. Thank you all for watching. My name has been Mr. Dogweb333, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye-bye now.